Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Raj Tekchandani, and welcome to the webinar. I'm your host today, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Cambridge Semantics. Today's webinar's topic is Anzo Smart Data Lake 4.0, a data lake platform for the enterprise information fabric. Our panelist today is Ben Seckley. Ben is the founding engineer and VP of Solutions here at Cambridge Semantics. Just a quick note on logistics. The webinar will run for about 45-50 minutes. The webinar is being recorded, so you will get all these links to the webinar recording after. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the questions panel of the webinar software that you have. Without further ado, I would like to pass it on to Ben. Ben, please take it over.
Thank you very much, Raj, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. At Cambridge Semantics, we're very excited about the launch of Anzo Smart Data Lake 4.0, and we're very thankful to all of our customers and partners who've worked with us on the journey over the last several years that really led up to this release of the product, which we're very excited to tell you about today. So what's really been common and consistent for Cambridge Semantics over the decade or so of our lifetime, and even before that at our time at IBM, is that we've really been focused on delivering a semantic layer, a layer of understanding that you spread across, one or more data sources to make that information automated and available to the business users in a way that makes the most sense to them in a fast and on-demand fashion. And what's been very gratifying, certainly for us and others that have been on the journey with us, is that this is becoming a much more of a mainstream and recognized concept. This need to provide business meaning and on-demand access to information to react to the business challenges of the day. And really, it's evolving past the semantic layer into an information fabric, which is semantic layers at enterprise scale. Michelle Getz from Forrester Research is really suggesting here that semantic-based approaches, which we'll talk a lot about today, are the foundations of the information fabric. But those who have been working with us now, building smart data lakes with Cambridge Semantics, know that this is very much the present and possible today, and real business value is being realized through the use of the semantic layer through our software, Anzo Smart Data Lake. So Anzo Smart Data Lake is the industry-leading platform for building a semantic layer. And why do we claim that? Well, first off, it's end-to-end. You don't have to piece together many different solutions and piece parts in order to deliver a usable big data solution. It has end-to-end capability. But through all of that, Cambridge Semantics has always retained a commitment to open standards, both in terms of the data formats we use, which as many on the call will know are open W3C standards for representing complex and diverse data, but also an open architecture that can work with data lake investments and infrastructure that you already have, can work with your existing NLP and machine learning tools, and can work with your BI and analytics tools. And of course, compatibility with all your good data sources that are required to feed the beast, so to speak. And then of course, enterprise scale, and that's really been the piece that we've been focusing on for the last few years at Cambridge Semantics, both in terms of making the enterprise knowledge graph scale, and also in terms of the overall architecture for how do you actually deploy a semantic layer through the Smart Data Lake for many, many data sources across the enterprise. So the question is, why do we need a semantic layer? So obviously there are data sources abound. That's not a new concept. But what people are trying to do with these things are ask questions, deliver on business commitments, find new insights to drive new business opportunity. And what most folks end up doing out in the world today is addressing these things on a piecemeal, in a piecemeal fashion. So somebody has a marketing question or a customer 360 insight that they want to go after. And so they independently go to these different data sources, build themselves a mini solution, and walk away with their answer, and hopefully that was valuable. And that takes a long time, and especially problematic if you have many individuals across the organization all trying to do this. And so you end up with a lot of these one-off solutions, and this really isn't scalable at the pace, speed, and scale that enterprises need to move today, particularly those that consider themselves or strive to be data-driven. And so what's really needed here is the semantic layer, this layer of understanding that connects information sources together so that users in a holistic fashion can gain access to the information in an on-demand, business-friendly way. So diving a little bit deeper into why organizations are looking to do this, and there are kind of two main thrusts that we'll talk about here. The first is really a drive for insights, which is really the ability to ask more questions faster. If you want to get insights, you have to ask questions, you have to see the responses, you have to be able to react, essentially have a conversation with your data to be able to trust the answers and move very, very quickly. So things like in our life sciences, customers are asking questions like, how do I design my clinical trial to benefit the most patients, or what is the market for a certain therapeutic area going to look like in 2020? And you can certainly imagine a lot of different data sources that go into answering these sort of questions, and the conversational aspect and the hypothesis-driven way that you would want to approach these things. And ultimately, why do they do this? Well, they want to uncover new revenue growth opportunities, affect their top line as fast as possible, and stay ahead of the competition. Why is this hard? Well, conversational data exploration in most instances just isn't practical. You have a business question that leads to a requirement to go and locate and understand the data. Oftentimes there's a data warehouse or other IT project that's spun up that has an analytics component that has to be delivered in order to get to the insights. And this just takes a lot of time for each question you want to answer. And this is fine if two conditions hold true. One is the data sources themselves aren't changing and the requirements aren't changing. So if you take the time and investment to spin something like this up, you're going to get ROI for a long time on a rather static environment. But as we know, that just isn't true. The questions are changing and the requirements are changing and the data is all changing. So this breaks down fairly quickly. The other side of this is the urgency of requirements and a cost-effective flexibility on delivering on business commitments. So a lot of our financial services customers have very complex regulatory reporting requirements that they have to meet. They have information coming from their trading systems, from their customers' account databases, from relationship information that they're managing, and then they have just this reporting environment that's constantly changing and very difficult to react to. And so what ends up happening is you have the regulatory folks in these organizations are responsible for delivering these specific kinds of reports, and every one of them is a multi-million-dollar one-off effort to go and deliver these reports on a one-off basis. And it's brittle, it's very manual, and it takes a long time, and they're just not able to keep up with what is required of them. And so the semantic layer is the solution to these types of problems. It's a Rosetta Stone that can translate and combine and tie together information from multiple different sources in the language of the business to afford flexibility in terms of how we deal with information coming in, and flexibility in terms of how we can make use of that information to get our business done and to find new insights. And ultimately, it disrupts these sorts of inhibitors that we've been talking about. So rather being in this very linear, stepwise world where you have to start with your question and end with the insights, the semantic layer provides this automated and integrated way to bring information together. And once that's stood up, each new business question that arises can be addressed in an iterative fashion. And the same is true for new business requirements or reports or regulatory submissions that have to be delivered. And so I think many people would say, all right, that sounds great, or we knew this all along, but how do we actually do that? This sounds really complicated, or we're already trying this with certain things. So where does this lead to? So how do we realize the semantic layer? And so one approach, of course, is the data warehouse. And I think if you broaden your definition of a data warehouse, this has really been the tool of choice over the last several decades that has been used to deliver business meaning and understanding on top of data coming from multiple sources. You define the set of business problems, you define your ETL processes, you define the analytic queries, and you make the data available for users who have to make business decisions. And these are very effective for certain classes of problems, but they have their limitations. They can take time to set up, but most importantly, they're really not suitable for the size and volume and variety of information that we're seeing today. So things like unstructured data or very ragged, complex data sources just won't fit with a data warehouse. In fact, that whole paradigm really rejects and excludes all that sort of information. So it's not really surprising that many of the big data and analytics analysts out there in the world are starting to call for the head of the data warehouse and say we have to try something different. I think it'd be naive to say warehouses are going away, but certainly new approaches are required. And so again, this is not a new thing. Now we have data lakes. People have been turning to Hadoop and Amazon S3 and Google Cloud Storage as the antithesis to the data warehouse. No structure, no governance, just big, vast buckets where you can put any file, any information type that you like. It's fast, it's cheap to stand it up, and that all sounds perfect until you have to actually go and try to get value from that information. And so what that has now led to is organizations requiring teams of data scientists to stand up whole new sets of capabilities downstream of the data lake to run MapReduce jobs, to apply data science, all sorts of complex one-off ETL. So what it has in effect done is just kind of kick the can down the road and not really address the core challenge, which is how do you get the data available to the users in a way that makes sense to them in an on-demand fashion. And so putting this in a little bit more in the context of data lakes, and really we're not saying data lakes need to go away, we're saying data lakes need to be improved, because the idea of using cheap storage, cloud computing, it's very appealing. These things are fundamentally scalable, they're elastic in nature, they're cost effective, they can be turned on and off. So let's try to take the conversation a step further instead of starting over from scratch with a whole new approach. But let's look at how data lakes started, right, and how did this journey begin for everybody. So if you think back to where Hadoop and these sort of technologies came from, they came out of enterprise search, these very homogeneous, large data problems of search on the World Wide Web, where you needed a place to put a lot of information. And so people started to apply these things to enterprise data. And so they stood these environments up behind the firewall and started to load information into them. And what they found was that they had to build, in order to make the data accessible, they had to build one-off solutions in order to make that happen. And that then gave rise to the data catalog, which is a metadata repository that keeps track of what do you have in your cheap storage, what do you have in your data lake, where did it come from, how do I find it, and maybe even some basic SQL access to still get the data in a rectangular fashion. Multiple problems with this, though. The semantic layer, a true semantic layer, has to tie this information together in the language of the business. And really what data lakes tend to do, and there's all this structured information, is it tends to dumb the data down into a rectangular fashion that is consumable by these technologies. And so to then bridge the gap into data that's then smart and usable by the business, you have a lot of data preparation, query generation, custom coding, tool integration to do all of this. So again, just a lot of now one-off complex technical work that's required in order to deliver insights on the information. And so our solution over the last decade and beyond to disrupt these problems is the enterprise knowledge graph. It's a very high fidelity, multidimensional way to link and contextualize information from multiple different sources. And when we talk about an enterprise knowledge graph of your data, we don't just mean relationships between sources and metadata. We mean we actually turn every piece of transactional data, every fact from your unstructured documents, every row and column from your database and spreadsheets into an intricately connected nodes and relationship set within the knowledge graph. And the challenges of this, of course, are you want to make it scalable so your graph can get really, really big, and you can manage different data sets, you can keep track of where it came from, keep things secure and governed as the thing starts to grow very, very large. And open standards play a big role in making sure that that's all possible. And so Anzo Smart Data Lake is a data lake based on the enterprise knowledge graph as its foundational data structure, and that's what makes our data lake different from other approaches. So it's a very straightforward, concept and principle, and we'll sort of we'll start off with very high-level descriptions of the product and the different capabilities, and then we'll get into a video demonstration that will show some of these capabilities in action. So from a very basic level, we ingest data, and as the data goes through our automated ingestion process, it creates this knowledge graph from all the different sources. And this is effectively how we build the semantic layer, that as it goes through this ingestion process, the data is now connected together, it has business meaning, and is on demand available for users who want to ask questions or gain insights. So how does this actually work? That was a pretty animation, but how does that knowledge graph actually get constructed, and how do users make use of it? So it starts with the automated ETL and ingestion. So to ingest data sources, we have a couple of different approaches that we'll get into in more detail, but basically we have an automated approach where we'll look at the data source, whether it's structured or unstructured, and automatically derive a knowledge graph and a target state model from that data as we ingest it, and all those data sources are loaded into the catalog. As we'll see a bit later on, You can also do manual mapping at this stage to provide guidance or map to some industry standard model as the data is being ingested. What we find works very well, particularly in very complex environments like in the sciences, where you have disparate information sources, a lot of unstructured content, a lot of ragged and unclean data, that rather than trying to do a lot of mapping on ingest, let's build a knowledge graph that effectively is a twin of what you had on the outside, and just build it, load it in, and then start working with it after it's been ingested. And so what does that automated ETL generation look like? Well, it starts with, say, a tabular data source like this one. We automatically profile that information, interpret what the schema is about that data source, and then generate Spark jobs, which can run on Amazon's Elastic MapReduce or Hadoop or Google's Proc environment at scale to very rapidly ingest these sources. We're talking about generating millions upon millions of these nodes and relationships per minute per node across these clusters that we're developing. So it's a very rapid, fast, and scalable ingestion process with minimal manual intervention required. Once the things are cataloged, though, we've loaded that data into scalable storage, but now we want to make use of the data. We want to massage it, transform it, link these different sources together, and make that data available for analytics. And that's where our in-memory computing capability comes into play, and that's using a feature we call graph marts based on data layers. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So graph mart is an in-memory cluster that we load a subset of the knowledge graph into, and these subsets can be very large. The in-memory architecture is horizontally scalable. You can load in a lot of data, but once it's in the graph mart, we can create new relationships. We can rapidly and iteratively transform the data into canonical models or industry standard models. We can conform the actual values of the data to get rid of any errors. We can establish a very granular access control based on views that are projected out of the graph mart. We can make the data available on demand. And then there, of course, is deployed in the cloud using the elastic scale of the cloud to allow the graph marts to be as large as they need to be. Think of a graph mart as opposed to a data mart is a very rapid process. We can load and spin up a graph mart in minutes from billions and billions of facts. So the cost of bringing these things up and down is very, very low and very, very lightweight, and makes really good use of cloud hardware. And so from a conceptual standpoint, this is what you have within a graph mart. You have your base layer, which are the data sets that you've ingested from your external sources. Then each of these layers that is either a rule or a data cleaning or a relationship or an access control that's added to the layer can be turned on and off. Think of this like Photoshop, but for your data. Your base layer of data is like the picture that you take on your camera phone. You put it into Photoshop, you add darkening or lightening, you increase the contrast, or you add a filter to make it look retro, and you can turn on and off these layers and sort of juxtapose different views of your image depending on what you want to see. But we've taken that paradigm and made it work for data, so that using the in-memory compute and the graph mart, you can turn on and off these layers and sort of work with your data at scale in a very iterative fashion. And this kind of breaks down the brittle linear ETL process that really takes a long time to get right. If you move everything into this layered in-memory approach, you can try things out, you can fail fast, you can succeed quickly, and really move forward with your data cleaning and data prep, all while staying inside of the graph. And so let's see what this looks like from a graph perspective. So here we have the three sources that we loaded in previously, and now we want to add a layer. And so you can, just by inspecting this data, it's not hard to imagine how you might want to relate some of these things. You've got a product that you want to link to its revenue and bookings and marketing information about that product, and there are some attributes on those graph nodes that we could actually use to build a rule to link these things together. And that's exactly what we allow people to do inside their data layers, is create this layer that now links these things together. In this case, it's fairly straightforward, but you can also imagine that the IDs don't line up very well. There's raggedness in the data. The linkages take some iteration of massaging to get right. And so that kind of linking from these disparate sources is not really suitable for a ETL process. It's much better done in memory in a layered iterative approach that you can absorb a little bit of error and uncertainty as you work towards continuous improvement. So here's just another example from scratch. An example from a financial services use case where you have a holdings table, automatically generates a little bit of the holding knowledge graph One row is represented there. Now you have an account reference, and it generates its bit of the knowledge graph. Now you have a security reference, and it generates its piece of the knowledge graph as well. And then finally, we add in our relationship layer that ties these things together. So this is what sort of the end-to-end process looks like for generating the knowledge graph. Here's another slightly more complex example from life sciences where you have this information coming from clinical trials, and this is an example of the raw data that's coming right out of the clinical study. What we want to be able to do is actually conform this data into a more user-friendly, more analytics-friendly model. So this is what the target conformed model needs to end up looking like, and so we use graph transformations to generate one from another. And we have a data preparation capability in our right inside of our dashboarding environment that allows users to prepare this sort of information using business rules in real time as they're doing their analysis. And we'll see some examples of that as we get into the video demonstration. But this is, again, behind the scenes, what's happening from a data perspective. And so none of this would be possible without the horsepower of the Anzo Graph query engine behind the scenes. It's a massively parallel architecture. It was designed and built by the team that built the technology behind Amazon Redshift, Netezza, and ParAccel. So there's a lot of years of database research and analytics and scale that have gone into actually designing this in-memory graph engine. So you can deploy it on 1 node or 10 nodes or 20 nodes or 32 nodes. We've benchmarked it up to well over 100 nodes to deal with a graph size of well over 1 trillion facts. And so you can really move forward knowing that regardless of how large your data goes, your cloud environment can scale up to make that happen. And then what the Anzo platform does in the graph marts around this engine is make sure that we're making use of the cloud compute very efficiently. Obviously, you don't want to stand up a 100-node cluster in Amazon and leave it up unencumbered for days upon days. That's going to run up the bill. So the graph marts manages that cluster and allows it to come up and down as required. And so once we have the graph marts stood up, that's when we get into our next capability, which is high-res analytics. This is an analytic experience that allows users to ask questions, build dashboards, build analytic views, gain self-service access to data directly on top of the knowledge graph. And why is that important? Well, the knowledge graph contains sort of the rich, multidimensional nature of all of their data. It hasn't been dumbed down or flattened into tables. It has all of the connections and relationships that was really inherent in the models behind the information that they care about. So they can interactively ask questions that join 5 nodes together in order to help build a heat map or do a search that spans 3 or 4 hops through their data model. And so all of this can be done, and all of the analytics they're creating are secured and governed and stored in our metadata catalog, so that any dashboard that somebody creates, you have a record of how they created it, what data sources went into it, what business rules they applied, and so those answers can be trusted and replayed in a very simple manner, all within the data lake. The high-res analytics also gives people the ability to do data preparation. So they can create those data layers and those different views of information right in the analytics tool. So they don't have to jump between their data prep and their VI experience. It can all kind of happen together. But as we know, most organizations have a whole suite of BI and analytics tools and advanced analytics tools and machine learning algorithms that they want to use to visualize and process data. So actually one of the key capabilities of the high-res analytics features is that you can actually prepare data sets and make them available on demand and in real time into any of those tools. So imagine this very complex knowledge graph of many entity types and many data sources. High-res analytics lets you prepare a very simple extract into a source like that. And one of the most important features of this is there's no query writing whatsoever. It was actually interesting. We attended the Strata conference last week, and one of the things that we observed as we kind of walked the floor and checked out what the other companies were showing off is the amount of SQL query writing that went into any of the dashboard or analytics capabilities, and it was sort of taken for granted that was a step that they had to take. Well, we know that most of our customers and their business users don't want to write any SQL, so we've taken great care to make sure that we generate all the graph queries that are required in order to drive analytics. And that's especially important to us because while there are a lot of people maybe with SQL skills, the number of people that know how to write graph queries is not that large, and so we want to make sure that we're not requiring any new skill sets within our tools. So let's take a look at an example of high-res analytics. So here's a dashboard that's visualizing quite a large and complex amount of data. This is 90 simulated clinical oncology studies, together with some electronic healthcare data, which in this space we call real-world data. And it's all tied together using this model. So while this looks like your fairly standard dashboard, it's actually touching, first of all, it's billions of facts and relationships that are driving this interactive experience. But one click on one of these filters or a small configuration change of the dashboard can result in a 5- or 6-way join across this model, which then has to be computed by the in-memory engine in real time behind the scenes with having no prior knowledge of what query was going to be asked. So it's that dynamic, iterative nature that really supports that question answering and that conversational approach to analytics that the query engine supports. And so the question now is, who can do this? Gartner talks about, citizen data scientists, which is this new class of user that's emerging in the enterprise who, has sort of a thirst and a hunger to ask questions of their data, to be more self-serve and self-reliant when it comes to analytics, but previously hasn't had the tools to do so. And so that sort of individual who has an eagerness and curiosity about their data can very quickly learn how to use the high-res analytics dashboards to answer their own questions, to build new views, to build new analytics. And generally speaking, within a couple hours of training and a little bit of, a little bit of work on their part to actually learn how to do it, they can come to speed very, very quickly. And so to sort of summarize data layers and high-res analytics, it's important sort of not to view these as first you build your layers to prepare your data and then you do your analytics. It's much more of an iterative process where you might ingest data, build some basic layers, get into your analytics, and then quickly through that experience you'll shine a light on any problems or any issues with the data. Then you can quickly iterate and add more layers or adjust your layers to quickly iterate and improve. And this becomes just this cycle of continuous improvement of the information. So unstructured data is a key piece of what makes the Smart Data Lake different. So here you have a high-res analytic dashboard that's showing a basic document search where someone has done some filtering and search, and it surfaced the document here where you can see that we've actually highlighted a number of key terms. And this is kind of where the open architecture of Anzo Smart Data Lake really comes into play. We have a lot of great text analytics and natural language processing that we do out of the box, but the open architecture allows us to tap into best-of-breed text analytics tools. In this case, we've tapped into SciByte, which is a really well-tuned life sciences entity extraction engine, and it's identified just a whole plethora of terms within this document and then added them to the knowledge graph. But what's cool, because it's there on the knowledge graph now, is now I can do exploratory analytics and visualizations and trend analysis and really deep dive and do data mining on top of this unstructured data that normally most tools will restrict you to looking at just unstructured data and doing some search, whereas here we can actually do the same exploratory analytics on the combination of structured and unstructured content. And so going one level deeper into this, how did we build this knowledge graph? We saw how we did it for structured, right? We started with a structured database like this insurance claims table. We built this bit of knowledge graph in an automated fashion. We did the same thing for healthcare records. But now we introduced a piece of unstructured content. In this case, it's a doctor's note that's talking about some experience that a patient has had. And as you can see from the highlights in the text, there are key facts that need to be called out or pulled out of this text. And so what the text analytics and data layers then allows us to do is now build this knowledge graph component like the note with the date, the event, and the sentiment score that's now tied into the patient record. And so now we have this knowledge graph that spans all three of these sources that users can then explore to ask questions, again, in that iterative fashion as they go and improve the data. Here's a look behind the scenes of the pipeline that we run that processes on unstructured content. Here's another view showing a document with a combination of histogram of what kind of elements have been pulled out, filters that let us drill down and search and find documents. Then you can see the actual document itself where the annotators have pulled out key facts. So this exploratory analytics piece that's been applied to text analytics. And so finally, now people have gone through this exploratory experience. They're looking through their data, but now they find a set of interests and they say, all right, I want to now go into Tableau. I want to go into Spotfire. I want to run my R script against this data. How do I do that? Well, using the high-res analytics, they create a table that, in this case, might be their set of products, and the different columns here are now have been assembled from this multidimensional knowledge graph on the left-hand side. And so we're kind of dumbing down the data a little bit and making it available for any tools that deal well with rectangular data, and those can be really any analytics tool. We support HTTP, REST, and OData, and all the protocols you would require to tie any tool into the Smart Data Lake to pull in the information. So kind of stepping back here and summarizing what we've looked at so far. So Anzo Smart Data Lake does automation of structured data, text analytics, and natural language processing to build, manage, and scale the knowledge graph. And it uses in-memory computing to apply scalability, security, and data governance, and making that data available in whatever fashion is required. So here's an example of a smart data lake in the life sciences that we call the Smart Data Lake for Digital Patient Health. So we integrate information from all kinds of information sources about patients, could be insurance claims, clinical data, prescription information, genetic, IoT, and wearables, build a rich, secured, security is a big one for this, knowledge graph of all this information about patients, and then make this available for all different sorts of business areas that are interested in this kind of information. So improving research and development, planning clinical trials much faster and more accurately, which saves a lot of cost and time, improving the patient safety and monitoring the patient safety, which is perhaps one of the most important functions of a pharmaceutical company. Then health economics, making sure that the money spent on clinical trials and development and the pricing, that all that works out for the benefit of the firm as well as the patients. And so these are all things that require the same information, so that by having this semantic layer across all this information, it lets these different business units access the data in the way that makes the most sense to them. Flipping things over into the financial services industry, although this one is not really specific to finance, this is across many different sorts of companies, are all really interested in everything they need to know about their customers, so loosely called Customer 360. But in finance, it's the account information, it's the trading data, it's marketing, sales, relationship information, everything they wanted about their customers, all tied together in a knowledge graph that scales to the full breadth of information that they have, and then makes that available to their marketing teams for targeted marketing and sales campaigns, and then compliance and risk management. That's possibly one of the most important functions of Customer 360, is making sure that all the trading activity is happening that's fully compliant and monitored. So here's an example reference architecture of the data lake, so many of the capabilities that we've been talking about so far. I'm not going to drain every box and arrow on this diagram, but suffice to say is that each category here, whether you're doing ingestion, running Spark jobs to generate the knowledge graph, using the Graph Query Engine cluster to do the analytics and data preparation, or the Anzo servers in the front end to give users access, all these things are horizontally scalable. So you can do a deployment that's actually one single node with all this capability on one server behind your firewall, or you can use cloud technology to scale this out horizontally to build a really enterprise-class solution. And we have customers that are obviously on sort of both ends of that spectrum in terms of how they're deploying this out to multiple customers. And so now we're going to kind of review the things we've been talking about, but take a look at a bit of a video that will walk us through some of these capabilities. And so the data journey that we're going to look at here starts with your ingestion of structured and unstructured content into the semantic layer, so building that knowledge graph, securing and cataloging that data using a graph-based metadata catalog, then using data layers in your graph Marts to prepare, organize, and reshape the data in real time. Again, think about how you would process your music tracks or your photos in Photoshop. That's how we're dealing with the data here, and then making that available to end users through high-res analytics, so that really deep exploratory multidimensional experience, or just simply making simpler extracts of the data available to users on demand in a tool of their choice. And so we'll start with a little bit of the video that will show ingestion into the data catalog. So we'll start off here with the data ingestion, and I guess I'll pause it here in just a moment to show what the screen looks like. So what you're seeing here, just from a high-level perspective, is the data lake product itself. It's sort of a one-stop shop where users, depending on their role, will log in to ingest data, to manage the business models and the knowledge graph, to explore and find new information, to perform analytics, to do data provenance and lineage, all in one place. And depending on their role, they'll have different capabilities available to them over here on the left-hand side. And what we're starting with here is data ingestion. We're going to connect to a new source of information. In this case, it'll be some CSV files, and we'll then show how we profile that data, understand the data source, load it into our metadata catalog, and then actually ingest the data into the knowledge graph using Spark. So it's real simple. We're first going to create a new data source. We're going to call it our clinical trial data store demo. We're going to import a selection of CSV files that makes up our data source. It's going to deal with them all at the same time. When we click Save here on those files, it's going to quickly profile them, create the new data source, and now we can drill in and take a look at the schema that's sort of been interpreted from these different files. So we can see here, here's a data profile of this information, so various counts, null values, distributions of different values, getting a sense of how good our data is up front. Now we can look at the actual models behind each of these things. So each of these files created what's called a class or an entity type within our model, and we can see the inferred types. So you've got things like the semantic type of integer or string. We can see some sample data to give a sense of what kind of values are behind each one of those things. And when we're ready, we just click Auto Ingest, and this is going to go ahead and actually generate a project, an ETL project with jobs that will create Spark code, run them on a cluster, and turn this rectangular data into the knowledge graph. And all of this can be done manually. You can specify your graph model through the ontology editor. You can meticulously map each property with transformations if you like. But in this case, we're just going to let the machine intelligence figure out the knowledge graph for us, which is, in most cases, is just the easiest thing to do. You bring the data in, it builds the knowledge graph, and you can start working with it. So we're deploying these jobs now. We're going to do the ingestion on our local Spark engine, but that can also be published on an EMR cluster or a Hadoop cluster and scale out to as many nodes as you want, which is obviously important. As your data is really large, you want that ingestion to be very quick and scalable. So here's another example of a data source. I don't think this video is going to kind of go all the way through it here, but what it's going to do is just show, if we want to connect to a database, we can do that as well. And the cool thing about databases is they have data catalogs where people have thought through the logical models. Sometimes they've put foreign keys. Sometimes they have good data description languages. We can use all of that metadata to build an even better knowledge graph than if we were just looking at flat files. So a really cool use case of the Smart Data Lake is just pointing it at your data warehouse and on the fly just building a knowledge graph that allows you to explore that information and one day even retire that data warehouse once you've built the knowledge graph. So we're going to take a quick look at ontologies here, starting with the model that was automatically generated from the clinical CSVs that we ingested. So we're just here looking at a couple of these different properties. We have some text properties. We have some numeric properties that were created for us automatically. And you can now look at the sort of the knowledge graph view of this. Obviously, the nodes and relationships in these models that were created. So the red one was created from the relational database where you had lots of different relationships. The blue one below is from the CSV files where you had fewer. And now we can sort of browse through and see all of the ontologies. I'm going to go grab another one, which is a model that actually connects these two things together. So the top and the bottom, the red and the light blue, were created automatically by the ingest process, but a data architect created this middle model here as a way to tie these two things together. And one of the great things about this is that a lot of the skill sets that you have in your existing organization can be used to build the graph models. You don't have to go out and hire people with new skill sets. All of our tooling and end-to-end processes have been designed to kind of work with what people are already familiar with and used to doing. So after the ingestion process happens, we can go in and get a provenance view of what actually happened. So we can see the data store where it came from, the schema that was recognized, the graph model that was created, and then all of the mappings that were automatically created that loaded it in. And we'll look at a different example of provenance that wasn't fully mapped. So now we've ingested data. I'm just going to go quickly back to the presentation here. And we can see where we kind of are in the data journey here. So we went through structured content, and we've ingested it. Now we're going to go look at the graph marts. So we've got the, these data layers that we're going to be using to clean and prepare the information. And this is tough to show in a very quick vignette in the video, but this will give you a sense of some of the processes that are involved in creating data layers to do that data preparation and data cleaning. So the first thing we're doing is creating a graph mart from 2 of these data sets. And what a graph mart is, it's an entry in our data catalog that says, hey, I'm interested in these 1, 2, or 200 data sets. I give it a name. I can see what data sets are. I can make that graph mart available for on-demand access. I can set sharing and security of that graph mart. And when I'm all done, I can actually take that graph mart. Once I've now found it in the catalog, I can take that graph mart and set it to active. I think that actually the video is going to do that in just a second here. When I set it to active, it actually loads that data up into memory, and now it's available to be used. And that's behind the scenes. That's where a lot of the interesting things that are going on. It can be targeting an existing cluster that I've already have running in my Amazon or Google environment, or if I don't have a cluster available, you can actually tap into the cloud automation and spin up a new instance that's right-sized for the amount of data that we're going to be working with. And so that's a big piece of how we make the best use of the cloud investments. And so now we're getting into a little bit the data cleaning and data preparation. So here we're in our high-res analytics environment, and we have a dashboard that someone has set up to help them clean and prepare some data. So on the left-hand side, we have our raw data set, which has a patient ID, a preferred term, a body system, a high-level grouping, and a toxicity. And we want to prepare that data into a table that has a subject, a preferred term, a body system, a high-level group. So we're essentially creating a mapping between what the incoming model looked like and what our target state model looks like. In this case, we're trying to conform the data to an industry standard set of terminology. And so we're doing this mapping process. And so in this case, it's obviously you're mapping the column headers. That's an important piece, that your data has the right names. But the data itself may need to be conformed. You may have irregularities in the data. In this case, you're looking at 20 different data sources. They may use different terminologies for the same thing. And so in our data preparation, we're allowed to create these formulas that can be very sophisticated. It's an Excel-based formula language that really anyone can use to do data preparation and data cleaning. And all of these formulas that people are creating are stored on the model. They're available as data layers in the catalog, and they can be reused. And most importantly, they're applied in memory as the data is being accessed in a very dynamic fashion. They're not part of an upfront ETL process that costs a lot to do. So if we get this formula wrong, or we need to go back and change, headache to add a space for a new variant that comes along, you just update the rule, and the next time you do the analysis or access the data in real time, you'll see the impact of that rule change. And that's one of the great features of what the data layers provides. And so now we've created essentially this table in our dashboard here, and now we want to save it as a layer. And so to save it as a layer, we create the name of the target class, we save the graph model that we want to save it onto, and now we've actually gone and created this layer that someone else can now use. So we've essentially prepared the data, we mapped it to a new set of columns, and now we turn it into a layer that can be used by anybody else who wants to access that prepared and cleaned information. But the layer is just a layer. It's created dynamically, and it's available for use. And so now we're going to get into the high-res analytics, but before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about a slightly different use case of the semantic layer. In many cases, organizations really like the semantic layer and the knowledge graph as a virtual hub and spoke for mapping from structured sources to other structured sources. It provides you this hub where you can map a bunch of different data sources onto the graph model, and from the graph model, you can now map onto curated tables, whether that's Hive or Parquet or other flat files or even a data warehouse. And what then the Smart Data Lake does is it generates the Spark jobs to facilitate this automated data movement from one structured source into another. the data itself is never written to a knowledge graph. It's simply using that graph as a virtual layer, that semantic layer, to map from one source to another. And this is a really powerful way of using the semantic layer that's particularly popular with some of our financial services partners. And here's as an example of an industry standard model that sort of serves as the hub in that hub and spoke architecture. As you can see, it's fairly complex, and this is loosely based on an industry standard model called 5.0 that's used for these sorts of data sources. And you can see there's a transaction, an account, and a party information. And so those upstream sources will all have sort of their own ways that they map to the sources, and then those downstream tables will all be different, sort of slices or views of this information. And so we can create very specialized ETL jobs within the product, very easy to do, with this nice Excel-based mapping tool where your business analysts that would generally create these documents and then send them off to be implemented. It's all done in real time. So from this mapping document, we're automatically generating Spark code that moves the data from one place in your cloud storage to another, applying the transformations in that layer. And then the provenance viewer becomes really important because it will show you, here's the transformations that were made to go from one data source to another, what Ontologies was using, and all the transformations that had to take place. And so it's a very powerful use of the metadata engine within the Smart Data Lake, is that automated data movement. That's a big part of the on-demand capabilities. So we're almost wrapping up here, just a few more minutes, and we'll save some time for questions. But I wanted to get into just a couple of examples of high-res analytics here. So here's a dashboard that someone has created, and as we can see that even as they're doing their analytics, they may find an issue with the data. In this case, the gender values are kind of all over the place. You have 1s and 2s, and males and females, and M's and F's. So as I'm doing my analytics, I don't have to go back to the ETL to fix this issue. I can just create a really quick formula right here, save that formula onto my model so that other people can use it, and now my data gets cleaned up in real time. And I can test the formula. If it didn't work, I can reapply it. And again, it's the in-memory engine behind the scenes that's sort of executing these queries and these rules on behalf of the user. And I like my rule, it looks good. I'm going to go ahead and save it onto the model in the catalog so that others can make use of this for further reuse. I might just move us along here a little bit quicker in the interest of time. So here we're just seeing an example of kind of the end-to-end process of building a high-res analytics dashboard. So you can see the end user is just configuring, navigating that graph model, building whatever visualizations they like, using a drag and drop editor to position the visualizations throughout, and then clicking to do the interactive visualizations. Because it's a knowledge graph, we also have a visualizer that's based on the underlying knowledge graph, so you can see the network analysis and see the relationships in your entities and find new relationships and explore the connectivity within the graph, sort of leveraging the natural graph structure behind the scenes. It's kind of interesting because when most people think about graph databases or graph technology, this is really what they think about. And for us, this is a nice feature, but it's just kind of an add-on to the normal line of business type of analytics that we support. Most of our customers like this, but they really more rely upon the standard analytics and the exploratory capabilities that we offer. Okay, so getting now into the unstructured data, which we've talked about. You can see the configuration of a pipeline where you're configuring the different components. So this is configuring the open architecture, choosing which third-party NLP tools you want to use, choosing the sources of unstructured data, and then ultimately running the pipeline, monitoring the process, seeing what annotators are running. If anyone's worked with unstructured data and tried to run NLP algorithms, you'll know that you never get it right on the first time. This isn't like an ETL process where you can come up with a specification, map to a target state model and run it, and you may have a few tweaks to make, but largely you'll get it right on the first shot. With NLP, it's a highly iterative process. You have your taxonomies, your ontologies, your tuning of your named entity recognizers. You'll run it and you'll have a lot of noise and maybe miss some things the first time, and so there's a lot of iteration and trial and error that's required to land on a high value text analytics solution. So everything that we've done in the Smart Data Lake for unstructured data is to support that iterative process, to rapidly try things out, to see the results of the NLP, to build a dashboard to see what it looked like, what the data came through, and be able to correct those errors in a highly iterative fashion. So here's just an example of a dashboard, filtering across thousands of documents, drilling into particular entities that were found, seeing the evidence behind the insights that you're drilling into. A key piece of this is of that continuous improvement within the text analytics is managing the taxonomy. So there's a whole set of terms and entities or a data dictionary that's kind of running behind the scenes that's powering the text analytics. And in many cases, that needs to be improved. So the same dashboards that are used to monitor the data can actually be used to do that same activity. So moving along here, just to sort of finalize this video, sorry for these pop-ups, thought those had been deactivated. We're moving forward here into the data on demand, which is now we want to make use of this information in any tool of choice. So for any given graph mart, I can enter into that graph mart. I can choose the data on demand URL and go and grab that URL and paste it into any OData compatible browser. So in this case, we're going to look at what happens when I load that data into Tableau. We do that. We can grab my graph mart. We can actually, OData allows us to pull some metadata along with that data, so you can see the classes, the types of information that are available in that web data connector that we've configured, and now we can see all this data inside of Tableau that we've pulled in real time. So that concludes the video demo. Just a couple of other screens to go through here. So, what are some of the broader benefits that we've been talking about here? So obviously there are solutions that you can stand up and get a lot of value out of, but what our customers are finding is that there are strategic benefits to the Smart Data Lake that develop as they adopt the platform at the enterprise level. So one we talked about already, which is the empowering your citizen data scientists. So as you make the data available in this business-friendly fashion through high-res analytics and in the knowledge graph, you're now empowering the citizen data scientists to ask questions, provide a lot more sophistication in terms of how they interact with their data, and do a lot of self-service that wasn't previously available before. Another piece is really accelerating the digital transformation. So the knowledge graph is really the ultimate future-proof layer for building a digital twin of your data. It keeps track of every fact and relationship in a fully faithful way to what the upstream data was telling you. There's no denormalization, there's no compromises made, there's no sampling of information. Every piece of information is there. So it's just a terrific home for information if you want to retain the full fidelity and multidimensional nature of it. And finally, making the data understandable. That one can't be understated. Instead of looking at obtuse rows and columns, the data is in a business-friendly model that end users can understand and really support their ability to explore and ask their own questions and gain access. And so wrapping up here with the notion of the information fabric, we've been really showing through this demonstration and through this discussion, how do you establish a semantic layer? How do you build a data lake, sort of one data source at a time? But really, this is a journey and a process of continuous improvement and evolution that may start with one solution, expand into another and another. In this case, we're looking at the solution sort of mapped across the drug discovery and drug development pipeline within the pharmaceutical space, but this can be really any line of business that's going to have, multiple different solutions with similar and related information that are going to connect together. So as the smart data lakes and these semantic layers are deployed, they start to grow into a true enterprise information fabric, a fully connected network of information whose value transcends the value of any one of these solutions. So how do you get started, right? I mean, no customer is sitting down with us and saying, all right, we've done nothing with you guys and we want to kind of get all the way to here. What's the roadmap to doing that? The reality is it's very easy to get started. You can get started today with starting with one or two sources or one or two high-value problems, build a semantic layer and realize value in just a few weeks or months in getting that going. Another question that we often get asked, and I touched on this briefly at the beginning, is does this smart data lake replace the existing investments? And the answer is no, is that it can work with existing Hadoop infrastructure, existing cloud infrastructure, and existing data lakes as a semantic layer. So unfortunately, our booth at Strata is no longer open, but of course, visit our website and feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to talk to you more. And I apologize, I ran up against the end, but if we have one or two questions, we're happy to stay on and take those.
Well, thank you, Ben. That was very informative, and we probably have a bunch of questions, but we'll just want to say that we'll make sure that your questions are all answered. We'll send emails or however else we can respond to you. Ben will get in touch with you. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them our way. Ben@cambridgesemantic.com or Raj@cambridgesemantics.com is fine. Let's take a couple of questions here. Can you write SQL if you want? Can you connect Tableau to Anzo?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think we talked about that one towards the end. I think we showed how you can connect it with through OData. OData and REST endpoints are the ones that we support, and most BI tools tend to work really well with those and don't require writing any SQL.
Okay. If the part of information, how the data sets are connected together, is missing, can the platform automatically connect them together?
Yeah, in many cases it can. Using common identifiers and common terminologies, it can automatically create relationships to things. But this is an area where people think you have to have a lot of machine learning because the combinatorial possibilities of tying data sets together is too high. But the reality is most people know what they need to connect together. You know that these data sets connect on this certain concept. They just don't know how to do it. And there's not an iterative, fast way for them to get it done right. And that's really what we focused on, is making that process of really operationalizing the connections you know about in a very robust way, and then surfacing the ones you don't so you can iterate and improve.
All right, I think we'll take this one last question. What graph query language do you use?
It's a great question. So under the covers, we use Sparkle, so the open standard that was developed by the W3C. So all of our metadata repositories, the data at rest, the in-memory query, it's all based on RDF, OWL, and Sparkle. So the data is highly portable, and anyone that's familiar with Sparkle can, of course, attack the underlying knowledge graph. But again, all those queries are generated for the user in the high-res analytics tool, so no knowledge of that query language is required.
Great, thank you, Ben. And with that, we are coming to the top of the hour. I thank you, everybody, for being on the webinar today. And like I said before, we will make the copy of this presentation available. And if you have any questions, we will answer them for you. So questions that didn't get answered, we'll answer them in the email or some way to get to you. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day.